My father built his company with a mop, a bucket, and one commercial cleaning contract he signed at a folding table in a church basement in Charlotte, North Carolina. No investors, no family money, no connections worth calling connections. Just Alton Cousins, 41 years old, with a second-hand van, and a belief that a man who does clean work builds a clean name. By the time I was grown, that one contract had become Cousins Holdings, a mid-size facilities management company holding municipal contracts across all of Mecklenburg County. Government buildings, transit facilities, public works. My father didn't just clean Charlotte, he maintained it. And for 30 years he did it wearing the same watch on his left wrist, the same leather shoes resoled twice, and with his attorney's number in his wallet before his doctor's ever was. My name is Cressida Cousins Gale. And everything that nearly destroyed me started with everything that man built. Before the divorce, before the courtroom, before the morning a judge read one line from a document and a man's face went the color of old paper. There was a Tuesday in October when my father called me and said, "Come to the office, not for dinner, not for a holiday." He said, "Come to the office and dress like you mean it." I thought he was proud of me. I didn't know he was preparing me. He walked me through every room that morning, not as his daughter getting a tour, as someone who needed to understand what she was standing inside. He opened contract files I had never seen. He walked me through employee records going back 19 years. He sat me down at his desk and laid out the debt ledger, every obligation the company had ever carried, every one it had retired, and the ones still open. He said nothing dramatic. He just showed me. When I reached for a file he'd already moved past, he said, "Stay with me. You don't inherit what you don't understand." I remember the weight of that sentence. I remember thinking he was being thorough in the way older men sometimes are, careful, a little ceremonial. I did not know then that he was already sick. I did not know his doctor had given him a number and he had decided what to do with the time inside it. Before we left, he stopped in the lobby. He stood still for a moment and looked up at the wall. His employees had hung his portrait there without asking him. Framed photograph, brass plate beneath it, his name and the year he founded the company. He had never mentioned it to me. I don't think he ever asked them to take it down. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, quietly, almost to himself, "They called this low-level work. Let them." I thought he was speaking about the past, about the people who looked at a black man with a cleaning contract and saw a ceiling instead of a foundation. I smiled and touched his arm, and we walked out to the parking lot and he drove me to lunch and we talked about my daughter Georgia and the fall weather and nothing of consequence. If you are watching this right now, whatever time it is where you are, I need you to drop it in the comments. Because the people who find this story at midnight carry it differently than the ones who find it at noon. And I want to know who is here. I didn't understand what my father meant that morning. Not fully. Not until years later when I finally needed to. He showed me everything that morning. Everything except the one page that would change my life when the time finally came. Henry Gale was not the kind of man who walked into a room and demanded it. He was the kind of man who walked in and made the room feel like it had been waiting for someone who actually knew what they were doing. I met him at a conference, not a social event, not through family. A facilities and operations forum in Uptown Charlotte. He was presenting a session on contract efficiency for mid-size logistics firms. I sat in the third row. He spoke without notes. He knew his numbers the way my father knew his. Not because he'd memorized them, but because he lived inside them. I introduced myself afterward, and he already knew the name Cousins Holdings. Not to impress me, just because he paid attention to the market he worked in. That was the thing about Henry then. He paid attention. He was a mid-level operations manager at a regional logistics firm. Steady salary, small apartment in Plaza Midwood, drove a clean used car he'd bought outright. No. Performance. No pretense. He wasn't chasing wealth. He was building competence, the way a certain kind of man does quietly before anyone notices. I noticed. We dated for 2 years before I brought him to my father's house. 2 years, because I knew what that dinner meant. My father didn't have a test. He had a standard. And I needed to be certain Henry could stand inside it without flinching. He arrived 7 minutes early. Dressed well, not overdressed, not trying. He brought nothing to the door, which mattered more than he knew. My father had told me once that a man who brings wine to impress is already thinking about how he looks. Henry came empty-handed and walked in like a man who understood the evening wasn't about him. Dinner was quiet, in the way my father's dinners always were. Deliberate. Alton Cousins did not make small talk at his own table. Midway through the meal, he asked Henry a direct question about the company. How would he approach a municipal contract renewal with a competing bid already on the table? Henry didn't hesitate and didn't oversell. He laid out a 3-step approach, clean and specific. My father nodded once and said nothing. 20 minutes later, he asked a second question. Something technical about liability coverage on a facilities management contract. Henry paused. Then he said, "I don't know the specific answer to that. I'd pull the policy language and sit with your attorney before I gave you a number." He didn't apologize for not knowing. He just named what he would do next. My father cut his food and changed the subject. After Henry left that night, I stood in my father's kitchen while he rinsed his glass at the sink. I waited. He dried his hands. He folded the dish towel the way he always did, once lengthwise, once across. Then he said, without turning around, "He'll do." I exhaled. I had been holding that breath since Henry knocked on the door. I heard approval in those 2 words. I heard my father giving me his blessing in the only language he used for things that mattered. Plain, direct, without decoration. I was so relieved I didn't think about them any further. My father didn't say Henry was exceptional. He didn't say Henry was irreplaceable. He didn't say he was the best man I'd ever meet. He said he'd do. At 41 years old and in love, that was more than enough for me. Years later, I would think about those 2 words again and realize my father had said exactly what he meant. Nothing more, nothing less. My father's study smelled like cedar and old paper. It always had. Bookshelves on 2 walls, a desk that had been in that room since before I was born. One window facing the backyard that he never opened. He did his most important work in that room, and he did it without natural light, which used to bother me until I understood that some men simply do not need the world watching while they think. He was already seated when Henry and I arrived. That was the first thing I noticed. My father was a man who stood when people entered a room. He did not stand that morning. He gestured to the 2 chairs across the desk and said, "Sit down. August is already here." I hadn't seen August Delmore when we came in. He was seated in the corner behind the door, a brown leather briefcase on his lap, a legal pad on top of it with nothing written on it. He nodded at us both. He did not speak. My father looked tired in a way I had been telling myself was age. I know now it was not age. He slid 2 documents across the desk. One stopped in front of Henry. One stopped in front of me. He said, "Read what's in front of you. Take the time you need." Henry picked his up immediately. He read the way he did everything, methodically, without performance. He got halfway through the first page and asked a clarifying question about the board resolution language. My father answered in 2 sentences. Henry read further and asked a second question about the effective date of the transfer. My father looked at August. August said the date was the date of the final signature. Henry nodded and kept reading. When he reached the last page, he took a pen from his inside jacket pocket, his own pen, not one from the desk, and signed. I watched all of that, and then I looked down at my document. My name was at the top. My father's signature was already at the bottom. August had notarized it. The language in the middle was formal and dense. Spousal consent, independent claim, Shareholder transfer. I read every page. I was a woman who had been inside her father's business her whole life, and I understood the shape of what I was holding. I was confirming I had no personal claim against the transfer. Standard practice. Nothing alarming. I trusted my father completely. I trusted the man sitting across from me. I picked up the pen from the desk and I signed. As I slid the document back, my father reached across and placed his hand over mine. Just for a moment. Warm and deliberate. I looked up at him and he looked at me the way he sometimes did when he had something to say and had decided not to say it. I thought it was affection. I smiled at him. He patted my hand once and drew his back. August Delmore stood from his corner chair and collected both documents without being asked. He placed them inside the brown envelope he had been holding since we arrived. He said he would be in touch regarding the filing timeline and that copies would be provided once the transfer package was finalized and recorded. He shook Henry's hand. He nodded at me. Then he walked out. I watched him go and thought nothing of it. The process seemed ordinary. My father had handled important matters with attorneys my entire life, and nothing about that morning felt unusual. I told myself a lot of things that day that I would spend years unlearning. August Delmore picked up both documents and placed them in that brown envelope. He looked at me once before he left the room. I smiled at him. He did not smile back. I thought he was simply being professional. I know now he was carrying something heavy. And I know now he went back to my father's study that same evening. And they spoke for a long time, and when he left the second time, he was carrying something else entirely. My father died 8 months after that morning in his study. The doctors had given him longer. He had other plans. The funeral was at Greater Bethel on Beatty's Ford Road, the same church he had attended for 41 years. Full house. Standing room at the back. Men he had done business with for decades. City council members. Employees who had worked for him since the beginning. My father was not a loud man, but he had built a quiet kind of gravity, and the room that morning showed exactly how far it had pulled. I will not stay long in that church. Grief has its own room, and I have already sat in it. What I need to tell you about is what happened after. The repast was held at the family home. Neighbors brought food. The dining room table disappeared under casserole dishes and pound cakes and aluminum trays of everything my father loved and would never eat again. People moved through the house in that particular way they do after a funeral. Careful, warm, slightly uncertain where to put their hands. Henry worked the room. That is the only way I know to say it. He moved from group to group with a drink in his hand, and his jacket still on, shaking hands, accepting condolences, leaning in close when older men spoke to him the way you do when you want someone to feel heard. He knew names I hadn't told him. He referenced conversations I wasn't present for. He carried himself through that house like a man receiving something he had been waiting for rather than a man who had lost something. I watched him from the hallway and told myself he was holding us together. That is what grief does. It makes generosity out of whatever it needs to survive. Midway through the afternoon, Henry moved to the center of the living room, and the conversations around him quieted without anyone asking them to. He hadn't been introduced. He hadn't asked for the floor. He simply stood where the room could see him and began to speak. He was gracious. He was well-worded. He talked about vision and legacy, and the responsibility of leadership and the privilege of having been trusted by a great man. The room responded warmly, nodding, a few amens from the older women near the window, a ripple of genuine appreciation that moved through the space. Phyllis Sampson was standing across the room. I felt her looking at me before I saw it. When I found her face, she held my gaze for just a moment with an expression I could not name. Not alarm, not quite concern. Something quieter than both. I looked away. Georgia was beside me. She had been beside me all day, steady and close in the way she gets when she is holding something in. When Henry finished and the Room began to murmur approval. She leaned toward me and said quietly, "He didn't mention Granddad's name once." I stood with that for a moment. Then I squeezed her hand and said, "He's grieving too, baby. People grieve differently." Georgia straightened up. She didn't argue. She didn't say another word about it. But I felt her go still beside me in a way that was different from grief. It was the stillness of a person filing something away, deciding to remember. I should have gone still too. I should have stood in that hallway and asked myself why a man eulogizing his mentor never once said his name. But I was burying my father that day, and I had nothing left for questions. 3 days after we buried my father, Henry went back to the office. I didn't think anything of it. A company needs its CEO. That's what I told myself. That's what I kept telling myself for the next 8 months. Georgia didn't call first. She knocked twice and walked in the way she had done since she was 17, and I knew before I saw her face that she was carrying something she hadn't been able to sit with alone. She had her coat still on. That was the detail that told me everything. My daughter takes her coat off at the door, always has. She walked past the entryway, past the coat hooks, straight to the kitchen, and she put her phone on the table face up and stepped back like the thing on the screen might bite her. I sat down. It was a photograph posted on a business social media page, a corporate gala, formally lit, the kind of event where Charlotte Money dresses up and calls it networking. Henry was in the frame in a dark suit, standing with a small group, and beside him was a woman I didn't recognize, Dana Whitfield. Her name was tagged in the post. The name felt faintly familiar, not because I knew her, but because I had heard it once or twice over the previous year, mentioned in passing after board dinners, attached to projects Henry talked about just long enough to sound ordinary. It wasn't the photograph itself that told the story. It was the details inside it. Her hand was on his arm, not at the wrist, not a polite touch. At the inside of his elbow, where you only reach when you've reached there before. Her body angled toward his in the way bodies do when they've learned the shape of another person's space. His head was tilted just slightly in her direction, not looking at her, just oriented. The way a man is oriented toward something he's already decided on. I looked at it for a long time. The kitchen was very quiet. Georgia was standing on the other side of the table, watching my face, the way you watch someone open news you've already had time to absorb. She had driven here with this. She had sat in traffic with this photograph and her own heartbeat and whatever she'd been telling herself to keep it together until she got through my door. I stood up and walked to the stove and filled the kettle. "Mama." Her voice was careful, not breaking. Careful, which is sometimes worse. I said, "I see it." She said, "Then what are we doing?" I took 2 cups from the cabinet and set them on the counter. I didn't turn around. I said, "We're having tea." For a moment, she said nothing. Then I heard the chair pull back, and she sat down. I could feel her looking at me the way she sometimes looks at a problem she can't find the edges of. She wanted me to turn around. She wanted my face to give her something to hold on to. Anger, tears, anything that confirmed the world was reacting the way it was supposed to react. I kept my back to her and watched the kettle. There is a kind of pain that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't crack your voice or blur your vision. It settles into the body like weather, pressure behind the sternum, a particular heaviness in the hands. I felt it standing at that stove. I felt it, and I breathed through it, and I did not give it the room. Because underneath the pain was something else, something my daughter couldn't see and I couldn't explain. Not yet. Georgia sat at that table and stared at the phone and did not understand her mother at all. I know that. I saw it in the set of her shoulders when I finally turned around and placed her cup in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it and looked at me, and I looked back, and neither of us said another word about what was on that screen. I knew what that photograph meant. I knew what was coming. What Georgia didn't know, what I barely understood myself then, was that my father had never been a man who left important things unfinished. Whether that would matter now, I had no way of knowing. Not yet. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. No return address I recognized, a law firm name I had never heard. Craig Sutton and Associates, printed in small, clean letters on the upper left corner. I set it on the kitchen table and made coffee before I opened it. I don't know why. Some part of me already knew and was buying itself a few more minutes of not knowing. 14 pages, stapled once in the upper left corner. The language was formal and precise, the way legal documents always are. Built to be difficult, written to exhaust before it informs. I read every word. The first thing that stopped me was the company name. Not Cousins Holdings. Gale Enterprise Group, printed across the top of the asset schedule like it had always been called that. Like my father had never stood in that lobby for 40 years. Like the name Cousins had never meant anything worth keeping. The rebranding had started more than a year earlier. New signage, new stationery, new branding language and company materials. Henry had explained it as modernization, market positioning, growth. I remembered the conversations. I remembered how little attention I paid them at the time. I sat with that for a moment. Then I kept reading. My name appeared on page 4, once, listed as respondent, which is the divorce filing word for defendant. After 28 years of marriage, after everything I had built beside that man, and before him and in spite of him, I appeared in those 14 pages exactly once. A respondent, a name to be disposed of. I read to the last page. Then I folded the document on its original creases, the way it had arrived, and I placed it in the drawer beside the stove. I called Phyllis. She was at my door within the hour. We sat on the porch because the kitchen felt too small for what she was about to say. Phyllis Sampson has loved me since we were 24 years old, and she is not a woman who softens things when softening them would cost you something. She sat in the chair beside me, and I told her what the envelope contained, and I watched her face move through something I recognized. Disbelief first, then anger, then the particular grief of watching someone you love be treated as disposable. She said, "Cressida, you need a lawyer. Today, not next week." I said, "I remember what I signed, Phyllis." She went quiet. Then, "What does that mean?" I looked out across the yard. I said, "It means I don't think my father did anything carelessly." She reached over and held my hand, and I let her. I could feel her trying to find the version of this that made sense. The version where I was being strategic, where I had a plan, where this stillness was armor and not collapse. She couldn't find it. From where she was sitting, there was nothing to find. A woman whose husband had just filed for divorce and renamed her father's company and listed her as a defendant had just told her she didn't believe her father had acted carelessly. It sounded like hope dressed up as composure. She stayed another hour. She brought up a lawyer twice more. I didn't argue with her. I just didn't move. After she left, I sat alone on that porch until the light changed. I thought about my father's desk, the 2 documents. My name at the top of one of them, his signature at the bottom. I thought about what I had signed and what I had understood myself to be signing. I thought about how often my father had solved problems by seeing further down the road than everyone else in the room. I didn't know what that meant for me. I only knew I couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen more than I had that morning in his study. Phyllis thought I was broken. I understood why. From the outside, it must have looked exactly like that. But there is a difference between a woman who has given up and a woman who is still waiting to understand something. I need to tell you what my daughter did, because I couldn't have done it myself. 3 days after Phyllis left my porch, I was still moving through the house the way you move when you are conserving something. Slow, deliberate, not spending energy you don't have. Georgia had called twice. I had told her I was fine both times. which was not a lie so much as a decision. She heard the decision in my voice, and she made one of her own. She drove to the office. She told me later she hadn't planned it as a confrontation. She had just needed to see it, the building, the lobby, the name on the door. She needed to stand inside it and feel what it felt like now. I understood that. Sometimes the body needs to go somewhere before the mind can finish its thinking. She said when she pulled into the parking lot, the sign had already been changed. Gale Enterprise Group, in clean sans serif letters, where Cousins Holdings had been for 19 years. She sat in her car and looked at it for a while. Then she went inside. The receptionist was young, professional, pleasant. Georgia walked to the desk and said, "I'm here to see my father. This is Cousins Holdings." She said it exactly like that. Not a question, not an accusation, a correction. The receptionist's expression shifted just slightly. The kind of micro-adjustment a person makes when they've been told something about a situation they're now standing in the middle of. She picked up the phone and called upstairs. Georgia watched her face during the call, watched the slight tightening around the eyes, watched the way she set the receiver down with a care that was almost apologetic. Henry was in a meeting. She could wait if she liked. Georgia said she would wait. She sat down in one of the lobby chairs and she waited. 40 minutes. She told me she counted them. And for 40 minutes, she looked at the wall across from her. The wall that had held her grandfather's portrait since before she was old enough to visit this building. The framed photograph with the brass plate beneath it. His name. The founding year. Gone. What was left was a rectangle of paint slightly lighter than the wall around it. The ghost of a frame. The exact shape of an absence. She said she didn't cry. She said something happened that was different from crying. A kind of settling in the chest. A weight that found its place and stayed there. She sat in that lobby in the building her grandfather built from a folding table in a church basement, and she looked at the clean rectangle where his face had been, and she did not say a single word to anyone. After 40 minutes, she stood up. She nodded at the receptionist. She walked out. She drove straight to my house. When I opened the door, I looked at her face, the particular stillness in it, the way she was holding her jaw. And I said, before she could speak, "What did he take down?" She stared at me. I stepped back and let her in. She asked me later how I knew. I told her I knew Henry. I knew what that portrait represented to a man who needed the world to believe he had built something from nothing. My father's face on that wall was the one thing that told the truth about where Cousins Holdings came from. Of course he took it down. It was the first thing he would have touched. I didn't tell my mother what the lobby felt like. I didn't have the words yet for standing in your grandfather's company and seeing the clean rectangle where his face used to be. But I drove to her house that evening and she already knew. She always knew. That was the part I was only beginning to understand. It arrived on a Thursday. A plain white envelope with my name written by hand across the front, in the careful script of a man who had learned to write before computers made handwriting optional. I almost set it aside with the rest of the mail. Something made me open it first. Inside was a single note on August Delmore's stationery. "Mrs. Cousins Gale. I hope this finds you well. When you are ready, I am here. Your father was a thorough man." I read it twice. Then I set it on the counter and stood there looking at it the way you look at something that has arrived exactly on time, and you are not yet ready to admit how much you needed it. August. Delmore had not contacted me since the morning in my father's study, not after the transfer, not after the funeral, not after the filing. He had sent no condolences, made no calls, left no messages. For months, I had told myself that was simply how attorneys operated. They waited to be retained. They didn't reach out uninstructed. But I had known, underneath that explanation, that August Delmore was not waiting to be retained. He was waiting for me. There is a difference. I was still standing at the counter when Georgia came through the front door. She had her own key, and used it the way she always did. Knock once, turn, walk in. She came to the kitchen, saw my face, and then saw the note on the counter before I could move it. She picked it up and read it. I watched her eyes go through the 4 sentences twice. She looked up. "Who is August Delmore?" I said. "Your grandfather's attorney?" She set the note down carefully, the way you set something down when you're not sure of its weight. "And?" I didn't answer. I took the note from the counter and opened the drawer beside the stove and placed it inside. Georgia stepped forward and pulled the drawer open herself. She looked at what was in it. Craig Sutton's letter folded on its original creases, and August's note, and then something else. Something she hadn't seen before. She reached in and picked it up. A photograph. Standard size, slightly worn at one corner. My father and me standing in his office, his desk behind us, the contract files visible on the shelf to the left. He had his hand on my shoulder. I was looking at the camera. He was looking at me. Georgia turned it over. Nothing written on the back. She turned it face up again and looked at it for a long moment. "When was this taken?" I said. "The morning he showed me everything." She looked at me. "What does that mean?" I took the photograph from her hand gently and placed it back in the drawer. I closed it. Georgia was watching me with the expression she gets when she knows she is standing at the edge of something and cannot see the bottom. I understood what she was feeling. I had felt it myself. That particular frustration of being close to a truth that keeps declining to introduce itself. I wanted to give her more. I wasn't ready. Not because I was afraid, because there is a sequence to things my father built. And I had learned from watching him that moving before the moment is ready costs you more than waiting ever does. Georgia asked me why I kept that photograph in a drawer instead of on a wall. I told her some things are for you alone. She didn't understand yet. She would. Georgia came in with her phone already in her hand and her jaw already set, and I knew before she sat down that whatever she was carrying had been sitting in her chest since the moment she found it. She placed the phone on the table between us and said, "It posted this morning. The Charlotte Business Journal. A full feature. Henry in a charcoal suit, photographed in the corner office of the building my father built. His name in the header where Cousins Holdings used to be. Dana Whitfield was in the second photograph, standing beside him at what the caption called a recent company event. Her hand at her side this time. Professional distance. The kind of careful spacing 2 people arrange when they know a camera is present. I looked at both photographs. I said nothing. Georgia picked the phone back up and began to read. Not the whole article. One paragraph midway through that she had clearly already identified before she came through my door. She read it the way you read something that has made you feel sick, measured, controlled. Like if you stay calm enough, the words will mean something different than they mean. Henry had said he was fortunate to have had the mentorship of a great man who believed in his vision, that the foundation he inherited was a gift he intended to honor by taking it further than it had ever gone. That Gale Enterprise Group represented the next chapter of something that began with one man's faith in what Charlotte could become. Georgia put the phone down. The word mentorship sat between us on that table like something that had been left out too long. My father did not mentor Henry Gale. My father transferred his life's work to a man his daughter loved, at his daughter's insistence, with his attorney present and his hand over mine, and a look in his eyes I spent 20 years learning to read correctly. He did not mentor Henry. He made a calculated decision about what to do with something irreplaceable. Those are not the same thing. Georgia looked back at the article. Then she said, "He's rewriting it." I looked at her. She tapped the screen. "That's what this is. He's rewriting how it happened." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Because she was right. The article wasn't about business. It wasn't even about growth. It was about ownership of the story. A man standing in a building somebody else built and slowly teaching the world to remember it differently. Georgia set the phone down, carefully this time. Then she said, "Granddad would hate this." I almost smiled. "Yes," I said. "He would." The room went quiet. Outside, a lawnmower started somewhere down the block. A car door slammed. Life went on doing what life does while people sit at kitchen tables trying to understand what has been taken from them. After a while, Georgia said, "You're calmer than I am." I looked at the article one last time, at Henry's photograph, at the office, at the company name, at the version of the story he was trying to build. Then I folded my hands on the table. "Maybe." Georgia studied me for a moment. Then she nodded once. Not because she understood, because she had finally realized I was carrying something she couldn't see. She picked up her phone. She didn't read any more of the article. I sat there for a long time after she left, thinking about stories. How easily they can be changed, how easily they can be renamed, and how some things survive both. Henry thought he was building the final version. He wasn't. He just didn't know it yet. Craig Sutton's settlement offer had arrived 2 days earlier. 12 pages this time, shorter than the filing, more focused. A number at the center of it that was meant to look generous and wasn't. A monthly figure, a timeline, a clause about Cressida making no further claim against any asset held under Gale Enterprise Group in perpetuity. I had read it at the kitchen table the same way I had read everything that had come from that man's office. Completely, carefully, and without expression. I had placed it in the drawer. Georgia was at the table with me when the phone rang. She had come by without calling, the way she had been doing since the article, checking on me in the particular way adult children check on mothers they are frightened for. We had been drinking coffee and not saying much. I looked down at the phone on the table and saw Henry's name on the screen. I picked it up. I pressed speaker. I set it back on the table without telling Georgia what I was doing or why. Henry's voice filled the kitchen. He sounded composed, measured, almost gentle. And I will tell you that composed and gentle from a man who has just filed to erase you is not reassuring. It is a performance of reasonableness from someone who believes they no longer need to perform anything else. He had already won in his mind. The gentleness was what winning looked like on him. He said Craig had sent something reasonable and he hoped I had taken the time to look at it properly. He said he wanted this to be handled with dignity. That word, dignity, from his mouth, on that call. He said, "You don't want this to go to a hearing, Cressida." Georgia's hands were flat on the table. She was watching the phone the way you watch something that might move without warning. Then Henry paused, just briefly. The pause of a man deciding whether to say the thing he has been thinking the whole time. He decided. His voice stayed exactly the same. No shift in register, no edge, no heat. Casual, offhand. The way men say the truest things when they believe the outcome is already settled. He said, "This company started with a mop and a bucket. That's low-level work. I took it somewhere. I made it respectable. The world we're operating in now is different, Cressida. Different rooms, different people. You were never really built for that." The kitchen was absolutely silent. And there it was. Not just arrogance, contempt, the kind that spends years teaching itself better language. I looked at Georgia. Her face had gone very still. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of a person who has just heard something confirm everything they already knew and hoped they were wrong about. Her eyes were on me. She was not breathing loudly. She was not moving. She was waiting to see what her mother would do. I looked back at the phone. I said, "Okay, Henry." I ended the call. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Georgia opened her mouth. I raised one hand, just slightly, just enough, and she closed it. I stood up from the table. I walked to the drawer beside the stove and I opened it. I looked at what was inside for just a moment. Then I took out August Delmore's note. I held it and picked up my phone and dialed the number printed beneath his name. It rang twice. He answered. His voice was exactly as I remembered it from my father's study, unhurried, precise, a man who had been doing important work quietly for a very long time. He answered on the second ring, like he'd been waiting, like my father told him I'd call eventually. I said, August, I think I'm ready. He said, I know, I'll see you Thursday. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded like a man who had been holding something in trust for a very long time. August Delmore's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Tryon Street that had been standing since before I was born. No reception desk when you stepped off the elevator. Just a hallway, dark wood paneling, and a door with his name on it in letters that had never needed to be large to mean something. He was already seated when I arrived. The brown envelope was on the desk in front of him. I recognized it immediately, the same envelope from my father's study, the same size and weight and color, handled so many times over the years that the corners had softened. He did not stand. He gestured to the chair across from him the way my father used to gesture. Without ceremony, without performance. Sit down. We have work to do. I sat. He said, I want to walk you through everything before you say anything. Your father was specific about the order. I nodded. I put my hands in my lap and I listened. August had been practicing law in Charlotte for 40 years. He spoke the way men do when they have explained difficult things to people in pain for a very long time, clearly, without rushing, with a precision that was its own form of kindness. He opened the envelope and placed a document on the desk between us. 2 weeks after the signing in my father's study, Alton had called August back. Not to the house, to this office. He had sat in the chair where I was sitting and instructed August to draft a separate document. A spousal equity trust, structured independently of the shareholder transfer package Henry reviewed and signed. Henry had never reviewed this document. The transfer documents Henry signed that morning were complete and accurate. They were simply not the whole picture. August explained that the trust had been properly established and filed as part of my father's broader estate planning. It existed separately from the ownership transfer itself. Nothing had been concealed from the law. The structure was there the entire time. What had never happened was anyone asking the questions that would have led them to it. August walked me through the mechanism without rushing. 49% beneficial interest in Cousins Holdings held in trust for Cressida Cousins Gale. 1 trigger. Divorce proceedings initiated by Henry Gale. 1 window. 180 days from the date of filing to assert the claim. If the claim was asserted, the beneficial interest reverted to me in full. If it was not, if I never came to this office, never signed, never activated it, the trust would expire and the ownership structure would remain exactly as it was. I sat with that for a moment. My father had not simply protected me. He had looked at the full length of what might happen and made a decision about what kind of man he was. The kind who trusts his daughter to make her own choices. He had built the mechanism and then stepped back from it. He had given me the exit and left the door entirely in my hands. I thought about the 173 days I had spent folding letters into drawers and making tea. I thought about Phyllis urging me to fight. I thought about the settlement offer sitting beside the stove. I thought about a man's voice on a telephone, offhand and certain, telling me the company my father built from nothing was low level. I understood then that Henry had not just made me angry. He had handed me back to myself. August slid the document across the desk. He said, "Your father told me you might not come. He said if you didn't, to let it expire. He said it was your life and your choice." I sat with that for a long time. Then August opened his briefcase and removed a second document, the activation filing, the final step, the part my father could never do for me. Only I could. I picked up the pen. 173 days into the 180 I had. I had come with 7 days to spare. I drove to her apartment the evening after I left August's office. Hadn't called ahead. I needed to see her face when I told her, not hear her voice manage itself over a phone line, but see her face, the way my father's face used to tell me things before his mouth did. She answered the door in her work clothes, still dressed from the day, a cup of something warm in her hand. She looked at me the way she had been looking at me for months. That careful, frightened steadiness of a woman trying to hold her mother together by sheer force of attention. She stepped back and let me in without asking why I had come. Her apartment was quiet, just the two of us. I sat down at her kitchen table and she sat across from me and set her cup down and folded her hands and waited. She had learned that from somewhere, the waiting without filling the silence. I recognized it and it moved me in a way I hadn't expected. I said, "Your grandfather left me something. I didn't know the full shape of it until now." "I do now." Georgia's mouth opened. I saw the questions forming. "What? How? When? Why didn't you tell me?" I raised one hand, just slightly. She stopped. I said, "I need you to trust me the way I trusted him. Can you do that?" She looked at me for a long time, long enough that I felt the full weight of what I was asking. I was asking her to absorb months of watching her mother appear to surrender, months of being told to wait without being told why, months of standing in lobbies and reading articles and sitting across kitchen tables feeling helpless, and set all of that down, without an explanation. "On my word, alone." She nodded. I reached into my bag. I did not take out a document. I did not take out a letter or a legal summary or anything that could be read and analyzed and questioned. I took out the photograph, the one from the drawer. My father and me standing in his office, his hand on my shoulder, his eyes on my face instead of the camera. I placed it on the table between us. Georgia picked it up. She held it with both hands the way you hold something you understand is fragile. Not physically, but in meaning. She looked at his face. She looked at mine. She looked at the way he was watching me in that photograph, with an expression I had spent 20 years trying to name and had only fully understood the day before in a 14th floor office on Tryon Street. What I understood now was not that he knew exactly what would happen. It was that he understood people. He understood risk. He understood that love and trust are not the same thing. And he had decided, quietly and without announcement, that if a day ever came when I needed protection, I would have it. Georgia's eyes filled. She didn't make a sound. The tears came the way they come when the emotion is too large and too complicated for noise. Slowly, without drama, from somewhere very deep. Not grief, exactly. Not relief. Something that lived between them and had no clean name. I did not reach for her immediately. I let her feel it. Some things need a moment before they need a hand. Then I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine. Both of us holding the photograph. Both of us in that kitchen with everything that had happened between us over the last months sitting quietly in the room, rearranging itself into something we could both finally stand inside. My daughter held that photograph for a long time. Then she looked up at me and said, "He knew, didn't he?" It wasn't a question. I looked down at the photograph. I said, "He knew enough." She wiped her face and straightened up in her chair. She had his posture. She always did. I just hadn't seen it until that moment. I was awake before the alarm. 4:53 in the morning, the room still full dark, the house completely quiet. I lay there for a moment and took stock of my body the way you do before something large, checking for fear, for nausea, for the particular trembling that comes when a thing you have been moving toward finally arrives. Nothing. Just stillness. The same stillness I had been carrying for months. Except this morning it had a different quality. Not the stillness of waiting. The stillness of ready. I got up and dressed slowly. I had chosen everything the night before. Not to impress, not to perform, but to honor. Dark navy. Simple. My mother's brooch at the collar, the small gold one with the pearl at the center that had sat in a jewelry box in my father's house for 30 years after she passed. I had asked for it at the estate, and Henry had never once asked me why I kept it or what it meant. That had told me something about him long before everything else did. I stood in the mirror for a moment. I was not looking at myself the way women look when they are hoping to be seen. I was looking the way my father used to look before he went into a room where something important was going to happen. Measuring, settling, making sure the outside matched what was happening on the inside. It did. Georgia arrived at 7 minutes past 7. She knocked once and came in, and we did not embrace at the door. We went to the kitchen, and I poured 2 cups of coffee, and we sat at the table that had held so much over the past months. Craig Sutton's letter, August note, Georgia's phone face up, Henry's voice on speaker. And we drank in silence and let the morning be what it was. Georgia wrapped both hands around her cup. After a while, she looked up and said, "Are you nervous?" I said, "No." She nodded. She looked back down at her cup. Then, "Are you sure about this?" I looked at my daughter. I thought about a man who wore the same watch for 30 years and kept his attorney's number in his wallet before his doctor's, and stood in a lobby once and said, "Let them like, it was the simplest thing in the world." I said, "Your grandfather was sure. That's enough for me." Georgia held that. Then she nodded once, the way she had nodded in her apartment when I asked her to trust me. Finished. Decided. We were done discussing it. We drove to the courthouse mostly in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled because everything that needed to be said had already been said. In kitchens, in offices, in apartments, over photographs and folded letters and cups of tea that were never just cups of tea. The silence in that car was not absence. It was everything we had already carried, finally resting. We pulled into the parking lot at 8:41. I found a space near the far end and turned off the engine, and we sat for just a moment. Then Georgia said, "There." I followed her eyes. Henry was crossing the lot from the far entrance. Dark suit, unhurried, shoulders back. Dana Whitfield beside him, her hand through his arm. The two of them moving like people who had agreed on every detail of this morning in advance. Deliberate, public. A performance for a room they hadn't entered yet. Georgia went very still beside me. I watched them reach the entrance. I watched Craig Sutton appear from inside and hold the door open for Henry with the easy confidence of a man who had already counted what was on the other side. I opened my car door. I said, "Let's go finish this." Craig Sutton held the door open for Henry like a man who had already won. Maybe he thought he had. He hadn't read everything. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights softened by the height of the ceiling, 2 long tables facing the bench with a narrow aisle between them. Georgia sat beside me. August Delmore was in the gallery directly behind us. I did not turn around to look at him, but I felt him there the way you feel something solid at your back when you are standing on uncertain ground. Craig Sutton was already at his table when we came in. Henry was beside him, jacket buttoned, posture composed. Dana Whitfield was in the gallery on their side. Henry did not look at me when I sat down. Not once during the wait, not when the judge entered, not when the room was called to order. He had already decided I was not worth looking at. That was fine. That was exactly fine. Craig Sutton was good at his job. I want to say that plainly because it matters. He presented Henry's case with efficiency and precision, walking the court through the asset schedule, the shareholder transfer, the company valuation, the settlement offer Cressida had declined. He was organized and confident, and he had built a clean argument on the documents he had been given. The documents Henry had given him, which were accurate, which were simply not complete. The judge was a woman in her late 50s, reading glasses low on her nose, who had the particular manner of someone who has heard every variation of human behavior in a courtroom and finds very little of it surprising anymore. She listened to Craig Sutton without interrupting. She made notes. When he finished, she reached for a filing binder already, sitting on the bench. The complete record. Everything submitted before the hearing. The room was quiet in the way courtrooms are quiet, not peaceful, pressurized. Georgia's knee was very still beside mine under the table. The judge turned several pages, stopped, read silently, turned back and read the same page again. Her expression did not change. Then she looked up over her glasses at Craig Sutton. In the same even tone she had used for everything else, she asked whether he had reviewed the spousal equity trust instrument and activation filing previously entered into the record as part of Cressida's claim. Craig Sutton's stillness shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. He said he had reviewed the materials available to him and requested clarification regarding the trust's relationship to the original ownership transfer. The judge nodded. She directed him to the filing dates already contained in the court record. Craig glanced down at his binder, turned several pages, stopped. The confidence did not leave him. But something else arrived beside it. Calculation. Then the judge began reading, not for her benefit, for the record. The beneficial interest, the trust instrument, the trigger, the 180-day assertion window, the reversion. She read it the way she read everything, without drama, without emphasis, as if it were simply information the room needed to have. Georgia's hand found mine under the table. I did not look at Henry. I heard him. The quality of his silence changed, a man absorbing something that was reorganizing everything he believed about the morning he was standing inside. The judge finished reading and set the document down. Then she turned to the certified activation filing already entered into evidence. She reviewed the dates one final time. The trust had been asserted within the required period. The filing requirements had been met. The beneficial interest had reverted exactly as the instrument specified. The room was very quiet. Henry Gale looked at me for the first time since we walked in. I had nothing to say to him. My father had already said it. Years earlier, in a study, in a brown envelope, with a man who did not smile when I smiled at him because he understood the weight of what he was carrying. I understood it now, too. 3 months after the hearing, on a Thursday morning in early spring, I drove to the building my father built and parked in the same spot I had parked in for 30 years. The sign outside still read, Gale Enterprise Group. That was the last thing that needed changing. Everything else had been handled in the weeks following the hearing. The asset reversion, the legal filings, the paperwork that restored what had been taken and dismantled what had been erected in its place. The attorneys had done their work. This morning was not for attorneys. This morning was for the people who had worked in that building since before Henry Gale knew it existed. The lobby was full when I walked in. Not a large crowd, 20, maybe 25 people. Employees who had been there for years, some of them since my father's time, standing with coffee cups and quiet faces in the particular way people gather when something important is about to happen, and they are not entirely sure what to do with their hands. August Delmore was near the back wall, briefcase at his feet, hands clasped in front of him. Phyllis was beside him. She found my eyes when I came through the door and held them for a moment, and I nodded at her, and she nodded back. And that was enough. Georgia was already at the front of the room. She was standing very straight. I walked to the table that had been set up near the reception desk. 2 documents, 2 pens, a notary already seated and waiting. I did not make a speech. My father never made speeches at moments that mattered, and I was not going to start now. I signed the first document, the company name, Cousins Holdings, restored in full, effective immediately, filed with the Secretary of State before the end of business that day. I signed the second document, controlling interest transferred to Georgia Cousins, her middle name, her grandfather's name, the name she had decided, in the weeks after the hearing, she would carry into every room this company would ever enter from this day forward. She took the pen from my hand when I was done. She signed beneath my signature. She did not look up. Immediately, she looked at the page for a moment, at the name printed above her signature, the name that was now hers in full, and then she straightened and handed the pen back to the notary. I looked at August. He opened his briefcase and removed a single sheet and passed it to the clerk without ceremony. The last filing, the last piece. Then 2 men from the maintenance team, both of them employees my father had hired himself, came through the side door, carrying the portrait between them. The frame was dusty from storage. The brass plate at the bottom had tarnished slightly. It didn't matter. They carried it to the wall where the lighter rectangle of paint was still visible, the ghost of a frame that had waited 3 years to be filled. And they rehung it with the care of men who understood exactly what they were putting back. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with silence. Georgia moved to stand beside me. We both looked up at him, at the photograph her employees had hung without asking his permission because they loved him and wanted him to know it, at the brass plate with his name and the year he signed his first contract at a folding table in a church basement. I put my arm around my daughter. She leaned into me slightly, just slightly. The room began to empty slowly, quietly, the way rooms do when the thing that needed to happen has happened and words would only diminish it. We stayed until it was just the 2 of us. Then, a little longer. I didn't cry until we were in the parking lot. Not from pain, from the specific feeling of understanding your father completely and knowing he understood you the same way, and knowing you'll never be able to tell him.